In the early years of World War II, one aircraft stood as both a terror and a marvel: the Japanese Zero. Sleek, fast, and astonishingly agile, it dominated the skies of the Pacific, leaving Allied pilots struggling to survive encounters with it. But fate has a way of turning strength into weakness. A single crash on a lonely island in Alaska, the determined efforts of American engineers, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge would transform this feared machine into the very key that helped the Allies shift the balance of power. What began as Japan's most devastating weapon soon became the Allies' greatest advantage. This is the extraordinary story of how the capture and study of the Zero changed the course of the war. The journey reveals both triumphs and tragedies, acts of skill, luck, and sacrifice that shaped history. The losses were heavy. The Zero destroyed hundreds of Allied aircraft in the opening stages of the Pacific War. Highly trained Japanese pilots, using its unmatched maneuverability, overwhelmed opponents who relied on outdated World War I dogfighting tactics. Even aircraft like the Spitfire, which had bested the Messerschmitt over Europe, proved inferior when forced into turning battles with the Zero. Skilled Japanese aviators were initially able to dominate, and in battles across China, the Philippines, and Australia, Allied air forces paid dearly. Pilots like Tadayoshi Koga also paid the ultimate price. Koga died instantly when his Zero flipped during an emergency landing in the Aleutians, leaving his comrades powerless to help him. Later in the war, as Japan struggled to replace its losses, new Zero pilots were rushed into combat with little training, often unable to handle the aircraft safely, and many perished before even facing the enemy. The benefits for the Allies, however, were profound. Koga's downed Zero gave the Americans an intact aircraft to examine, a treasure of intelligence that revealed both the strengths and the flaws of Japan's most advanced fighter. Engineers discovered that while the Zero had remarkable agility and range, it was fragile, with no armor or self-sealing fuel tanks, making it highly vulnerable once its weaknesses were exploited. These revelations led to the creation of new combat tactics, like Lieutenant Commander John Thatch's Thatch Weave, which allowed American pilots to fight on equal terms. They also inspired the design and refinement of new aircraft such as the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which was tougher, more heavily armed, and ultimately superior to the Zero. With these advantages, the Allies began to reverse Japan's dominance in the air. In the end, the Zero, once the symbol of Japanese superiority, became a tool that helped shorten the war. Its capture saved lives by giving Allied pilots the knowledge they needed to survive and succeed in combat. What had started as a machine of destruction for one side became an unexpected gift to the other, turning tragedy into opportunity and changing the fate of the Pacific War forever. To unravel the mystery of why the Japanese Zero seemed nearly indestructible, two captured Mitsubishi fighters proved essential. When Allied forces first encountered Japan's A6M Zero at the start of the Pacific conflict, the experience was both a military and psychological shock that is hard to grasp today. Although the Zero was a fresh design, it had already seen 2 years of combat in China before Western pilots faced it in late 1941 and early 1942. Intelligence. Officials at the time refused to believe that Japan could create or build a machine that rivaled Western aircraft, even though reports kept arriving of its astonishing agility and performance. Only after a fully intact model was recovered in the Aleutians following the Battle of Midway were engineers able to study it closely, subjecting it to rigorous trials and measuring it against the best Allied aircraft. From this analysis, Allied designers gradually identified the plane's strengths and flaws, knowledge that would later guide the creation of fighters able to challenge and defeat it in the sky. This breakthrough was possible only because they had a complete specimen to work with, though it was not the first Zero ever captured. Another had already been in American hands before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The restoration and testing of both examples, carried out almost simultaneously, shattered the aura of invulnerability that had surrounded the aircraft. Japan was the first non-Western nation to produce an all-metal, low-wing monoplane with a closed cockpit, a leap forward embodied in the Zero. It took to the air for its maiden flight on April 1, 1939, the work of Mitsubishi's gifted designer Jiro Horikoshi. It offered unmatched speed, maneuverability, and simplicity of construction, and boasted a revolutionary range of over 1,900 miles. This capability came at the cost of features considered essential by Western nations, such as protective armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Its lightweight gave it a superior power-to-weight ratio, making it exceptionally nimble and among the lightest frontline fighters ever built. For a time, the Zero, known to Allied forces as the Zeke, dominated the skies across the vast Pacific. Yet its supremacy did not last. By mid-1942, new American fighters like the F-4U Corsair and F-6F Hellcat had tilted the balance, giving skilled U.S. pilots an edge in battle. The Zero remained in service throughout the war. Built in larger numbers than any other Japanese plane, and modified versions continued flying until 1945. After ground testing, the Zero first saw action in China in July 1940 with the 12th Kokutai, an air wing that quickly gained dominance. Against outdated Russian, American, and Chinese aircraft, many still biplanes, the Zero racked up an extraordinary kill record. Chinese pilots came to view it as virtually unbeatable, often withdrawing at the mere sight of it. By the latter half of 1940, Japan had established total air superiority, downing 59 enemy planes in the air and destroying 101 more on the ground without a single Zero lost in combat. In early 1941, the American volunteer group, the famed Flying Tigers, began facing the Zero. Though their Curtiss P-40 Warhawks were outdated, the American pilots proved tougher opponents than the Japanese had previously encountered. Their engagements revealed that the Zero's pilots were not infallible, a lesson the Americans learned quickly. Reports of the fighters' impressive abilities began reaching the AVG's commander, Brigadier General Claire Chennault, who passed them on to Washington. However, U.S. authorities often dismissed these accounts as exaggerated or unlikely. This skepticism stemmed largely from the widespread belief that Japan lacked the capability to produce advanced aircraft, and that its aviation industry merely churned out inferior imitations of obsolete Western designs. Such thinking was echoed in articles of the time, including a January 1941 piece titled "Japan is Not an Air Power" in Flying and Popular Aviation magazine, which insisted Japan's military planes were too few and too poor in quality to matter. Japan's aviation strength was often dismissed as weak compared to other major powers, largely because its civilian aviation sector was underdeveloped. Many observers at the time believed the Japanese had only limited skill in handling complex machinery, claiming they merely excelled at copying others rather than innovating on their own. But copying in the world of aircraft design meant adopting technology already years out of date. Since airplanes were the most advanced machines of the era, building them required creativity and precision beyond what critics thought Japan's industries could achieve. The argument was that Japanese factories struggled to reach the extreme accuracy demanded by aviation. The article even suggested that while one day Japan might gain enough technical expertise to close the gap, that time was far in the future. Education in Japan was portrayed as insufficient for creating skilled engineers, with the nation instead producing loyal patriots who lacked the training to build advanced machines. Patriotism, the author argued, might please Japan's leaders, but it had no effect on engines requiring 1,000 horsepower. Machines had no regard for noble ideals. In conclusion, the writer declared Japan to be a sixth-rate air power in both quantity and quality, unable to stand against a major opponent such as the United States or the Soviet Union. Yet within 10 months of this article hitting American newsstands, Pearl Harbor was attacked, and the reality was starkly different. The first real sign that Japan had produced a first-class, original fighter reached American hands on November 26, 1941, the very day the Japanese carrier strike force departed for Pearl Harbor. A thick fog caused 2 naval pilots from the 22nd Air Flotilla to lose contact with their group of 33 aircraft flying from Taiwan to Saigon in French Indochina. Without radios, which had been removed to save weight and extend range, they followed their compass bearings until they spotted a beach near a coastal village. Relieved, they prepared to land. 10, piloted by Petty Officer First Class Shimo Anu from Fukuoka Prefecture, carried serial number 3372 and tail code V172. The other, flown by Petty Officer Second Class Takaki Shimohigashi from Kure in Hiroshima Prefecture, bore tail code V174, though its serial number is unknown. Their intended route had been southwest toward Hainan Island and onward to Saigon, but instead they had drifted to the Leizhou Peninsula near Tietsun, an error that baffled them. Both planes came down on the beach as the fog lifted. Shimo's Zero was badly damaged in the landing, but Anu's machine touched down safely. The pilots climbed out to find local students watching and asked to be taken to a telephone to contact their base. They were led to a nearby schoolhouse but were never seen again. Post-war accounts suggest that Chinese militia captured them and, realizing the value of their prize, executed them quickly to prevent rescue. Anu's intact Zero was salvaged from the beach, while Shimohigashi's wrecked fighter was hastily chopped apart and carried away in pieces to keep the Japanese from discovering its capture. Over the following months, both aircraft were transported inland to Liuzhou. By late summer 1942, 10 had been reconstructed with new panels crafted to replace those lost during the move. Around this time, Major General Nathan Twining, then Director of War Organization and Movement, visited the area on a liaison mission to the Chinese Air Force and was shown the captured fighters. He informed General Chanot of their existence. Later, in October 1942, General Gerhard Neumann of the U.S. 23rd Fighter Group issued orders under Chanot's command for restoration work to proceed. Together with Staff Sergeant George L. Mackey, the team used parts from both planes to assemble one flyable Zero. The goal was to pit the rebuilt aircraft against American fighters to fully assess its capabilities. War correspondent Bill Barnes of Yank magazine accompanied them, documenting the process. Alongside them was M. McGregor, a Defense Department photographer assigned to document and film the recovery effort. Investigators noted that both Zeros lacked radios, even though they had originally been designed to carry them. Evidence also showed that the aircraft had been repainted with Chinese camouflage and insignia before testing began. Newman worked extensively on 3372, adjusting the engine timing, fitting American radios for communication, and running a week of checks on the controls and engine. During one of these inspections, he uncovered a small personal keepsake hidden in a wing ammunition bay, a comb shaped like a Japanese woman's hair ornament, believed to have belonged to a wife or sweetheart of the pilot. Soon afterward, Colonel John R. Allison, commander of the 75th Fighter Squadron, arrived by train at Liuzhou to conduct flight trials, becoming the first American to fly a captured Zero. Since the landing gear could not retract, he flew the short distance to the airfield at Kunming with the wheels locked down. The hydraulic system was beyond repair, so Newman replaced the parts with salvaged components from wrecked Japanese bombers and even reused original Japanese spark plugs. Tests in the workshop showed the landing gear functioned properly, but during a later flight, the wheels failed to retract, and the Zero sustained damage upon landing, twisting its frame. Despite the mishap, Allison emerged unhurt. After more difficult repairs, the Zero returned to flight. During this period, 5 renowned American aces from the 23rd Fighter Group had the chance to test fly the Japanese fighter, forming an exclusive group. These included John R. Johnny Allison with 6 victories, Albert J. Ajax, Baumler with 9, Clinton D. Casey, Vincent, Bruce K. Holloway with 13, and Grant Mahoney with 5. Once testing was complete, 3372 flew from Kunming, China, to Karachi, India, escorted by P-40s of the 23rd Fighter Group. Mechanical troubles forced all the escorts to make emergency landings, yet the Japanese-built Zero completed the demanding journey without failure, reaching India alone. From there, it was shipped to the United States for more trials. The transatlantic voyage was rough, and the plane's forward fuselage and wings were damaged during a violent storm. After switching ships in Havana, Cuba, the battered Zero reached the mainland. The Curtiss Aircraft Company offered to rebuild it free of charge in exchange for permission to test it against their own fighters. Following 6 months of work at Curtiss's Buffalo, New York, plant, the restored Zero underwent more evaluations. at Wright Field in Ohio and Eglin Field in Florida beginning in September 1943. It now carried American markings, with the tailcode EB-200. During a 1945 war bond tour in California, 03372 was photographed, but afterward it vanished without trace. No record survives to say whether it was scrapped, destroyed, or perhaps forgotten in storage waiting to be rediscovered. Yet its legacy endured. 03372 is often remembered as the captured aircraft that gave Allied engineers the insights needed to design planes capable of defeating Japan's fighter dominance in the Pacific. While it was being reassembled on a rough Chinese airstrip in June 1942, a Japanese task force under Rear Admiral Kakuta was advancing toward the Aleutian Islands off Alaska. The barren, windswept chain was chosen as the target of an operation meant to distract from Japan's much larger offensive at Midway, 2,000 miles south. The Northern Fleet's mission was not only to raid the American base at Dutch Harbor, just 100 miles from the Alaskan mainland, but also to support planned landings on Attu and nearby islands. Kiska and Attu in the Aleutian chain were the only American territories taken and held by enemy troops during the Second World War. On the morning of June 3, 1942, Dutch Harbor became the focus of a Japanese strike launched from the carriers Ryujo and Junyo, which were supported by 2 heavy cruisers and 3 destroyers. Because the weather was so poor and the cloud cover so dense, Junyo's aircraft were forced to turn back, but the attack group from Ryujo pressed ahead. 13 bombers and 30 fighter escorts groped their way through the mist, unable to fly in formation, navigating only by dead reckoning. A fortunate break in the clouds finally exposed Dutch Harbor, and the Japanese seized the opportunity to strike. Their assault destroyed radio installations, fuel stores, and vital harbor structures. Lieutenant Mutsumi Yamagami commanded the attack group, and his Zeros strafed seaplanes moored helplessly in the harbor without encountering any American fighters to oppose them. Among the attackers was Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga, whose Zero was struck by small arms fire that ruptured his fuel tank. Realizing that the leak was worsening and that he had no hope of returning to the carrier, Koga prepared to make an emergency landing. He reported his situation to Yamagami, then turned toward a small, barren island east of Dutch Harbor. This island had been identified in advance as an emergency site where downed pilots could await submarine rescue. From the sky, Yamagami observed the location and thought it appeared safe. Flat, grassy, and seemingly ideal for a landing. He watched as Koga approached steadily, clearly in control and maneuvering calmly as though the situation were under control. But the ground was deceiving. What looked like firm grass was in fact a treacherous bog of muskeg, common in the Arctic. As soon as the wheels touched, Koga's Zero flipped violently and landed inverted. Yamagami saw no sign of movement afterward. Koga never emerged from the cockpit, and his life likely ended the instant his head struck the instrument panel during the crash. Japanese pilots had strict orders to destroy any Zero that might fall into enemy hands, but Yamagami could not bring himself to fire on the wreck, believing his comrade might still be alive but gravely injured. Low on fuel and with fog rolling in, he had no choice but to lead the remaining aircraft back to Ryujo. Later that evening, a submarine crew sent to investigate tried to locate and recover Koga, but worsening weather made it impossible and they were forced to retreat empty-handed. Not long after, an American patrol spotted the downed fighter. A ground team landed and discovered the aircraft in remarkably good condition, with only minor damage to the nose and wing tips caused by the impact. Koga's body was still strapped into the cockpit, his neck broken and his head crushed from the collision with the controls. His personal effects and photographs were found inside his flight suit. The Americans gave him a burial in the area, but their attention was riveted on the aircraft itself. For the first time, they had a nearly intact A6M0 in their possession, the very machine that had been devastating Allied forces across the Pacific since the war began. Until this moment, Allied intelligence had only been able to study small fragments salvaged from destroyed Zeros at Pearl Harbor or in the Philippines. Another damaged Zero under repair in China was still incomplete. Koga's aircraft, by contrast, was almost pristine. The wreck was carefully dismantled, packed, and shipped to North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego. arriving in August 1942. Inside a cavernous blimp hangar, technicians disassembled it further, examined every component, and began restoration. Damaged sections of the tail, canopy, and nose were painstakingly repaired. The broken Japanese propeller was replaced with a Hamilton standard model from the United States, which was nearly identical. U.S. insignia replaced the rising sun markings, and by early October the plane was ready to fly again. Without any blueprints or technical manuals, every step of the repair had been challenging, but the effort paid off. The Zero was test flown at San Diego, then transferred to Wright Field in Ohio for more exhaustive evaluations. For the first time, American experts could see the Zero's capabilities and weaknesses under controlled conditions. They discovered that while the aircraft excelled in range, agility, and maneuverability, it also had glaring vulnerabilities. The plane carried no armor protection and lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, making it dangerously prone to catching fire after even minimal damage. It rolled sluggishly, performed poorly at high altitudes, and lost stability when forced into steep dives. Yet in skilled hands it remained a deadly weapon, capable of outmaneuvering almost anything then flying for the Allies. To counter this threat, new tactics had to be created. Lieutenant Commander John S. Thatch, who flew the captured Zero in its early trials, developed the famous Thatch Weave, a defensive maneuver that allowed slower, heavier American planes to protect each other while engaging the nimble Japanese fighter. Thatch and other tacticians stressed that under no circumstances should pilots attempt to turn fight with the Zero. Instead, they were trained to gain altitude, dive at high speed, and strike before climbing back out of reach. At the same time, Grumman was introducing the F-6F Hellcat, a fighter designed directly in response to the Zero's strengths. Armed with 6 heavy machine guns, armored protection, and a rugged design capable of taking punishment, the Hellcat was not as elegant or agile, but proved to be an ideal counter. When matched against Zeros, the Hellcat could outlast and overpower them, steadily turning the tide of air combat in the Pacific. By December 1942, Koga's Zero was finally destroyed during stress tests at Wright Field, but by then it had already given American forces a decisive edge. The intelligence gleaned from it was shared with designers, trainers, and combat pilots across the services. Meanwhile, Japan attempted to refine the Zero, adding more powerful engines, minor handling improvements, and eventually self-sealing fuel tanks. But these changes came too late. The real weakness became the steady loss of Japan's experienced pilots, whose skill had once made the Zero formidable. Training programs were shortened drastically, and replacements sent to the front lines were often young, barely capable of basic flight operations. Many rookies had so little practice that they could scarcely take off and land safely before being ordered into combat. By the war's final stages, desperation led to waves of kamikaze missions, a grim reminder of how far the mighty Zero had fallen from its early dominance. In its prime, during the first half of the Pacific War, a few hundred Zeros destroyed hundreds more Allied planes. Taking advantage of outdated dogfighting tactics inherited from World War I, where turning inside the opponent was considered the best strategy. Against the Zero, which could outturn anything in the sky, this approach proved disastrous. Even Britain's vaunted Spitfire, successful against German Messerschmitts, found itself outclassed by the Zero in turning battles over northern Australia. Only commanders who adapted quickly, like those in the U.S. Navy and the American Volunteer Group, realized that success against the Zero required abandoning old methods. Thus, what began as a tragedy for Koga became an ironic turning point in the war. His downed fighter, nearly untouched, gave the Allies an unprecedented opportunity to study their opponent's most advanced technology firsthand. The knowledge gained from that one crash helped shape new strategies, new aircraft, and new tactics that not only leveled the playing field, but eventually shifted it entirely. By revealing the Zero's hidden weaknesses, Koga's loss ultimately contributed to shortening the conflict, sparing countless lives on both sides, and ending the era when the Japanese Zero ruled the skies over the Pacific.